The desert begins in silence. A cracked floor of ancient earth stretches endlessly in every direction, shimmering beneath a merciless sun. Heat dances on the horizon, a mirage of water that will never come. And cutting through this desolation, footprints. Clear, deliberate, pressed deep into the sand. The camera follows them across the wasteland, step after step. Until, without reason, they stop. No turn, no struggle, no continuation. Just an end. As though the desert itself swallowed the ones who made them dot in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. A young couple vanished without a trace. All that remained were footprints frozen in silence, ending in the middle of nowhere, Death Valley. A place of extremes where the heat can melt the solace of your shoes by day, and the cold can freeze your breath by night. A place where sound is swallowed by the emptiness, where even the wind feels haunted. For centuries, travelers and wanderers have crossed this barren sea of rock and sand, but not all of them returned. Some stories of disappearance are explained by exhaustion, heat stroke, or simple miscalculation, but others remain mysteries. This is one of those stories. Their names were Daniel Harper and Emily Cross. Daniel was 28, a photographer from Oregon, chasing the beauty of desolate landscapes with his camera. Emily was 26, a writer from Colorado, quiet, thoughtful, always looking for the poetry in the smallest things. Together, they made an inseparable pair. Adventurers, dreamers, not reckless, but enchanted by the kind of places most people feared to go. On social media, their excitement was clear. A photo of their car packed with camping gear. A caption from Emily, "Into the desert we go." No service, no noise, just stars and silence. A short clip from Daniel, smiling as he adjusted the camera mounted to the dashboard. "Death Valley, here we come. Wish us luck." They had no idea these would be their final messages to the world. The first day of their trip passed quietly. They checked into a small roadside motel near the edge of Death Valley. The manager remembered them well, two polite, cheerful young people asking about hiking trails and scenic viewpoints. They studied their maps late into the evening, circling areas they wanted to see. By morning, they were gone, heading deeper into the desert. Their last confirmed stop was at a gas station just before the park entrance. The security cameras captured them buying bottled water, snacks, and 2 folded maps. Emily laughed at the heat, already unbearable before noon, while Daniel asked the cashier about less crowded routes. The cashier later recalled how alive they seemed, how excited. Nothing about them felt unusual. As Daniel sent a final text to his brother, "Heading deep into the valley today. We'll check in tonight." No one could have imagined it would be the last anyone heard from him. Hours passed. The sun sank lower. Somewhere out there, the couple's car was seen. One tourist later swore they spotted a white SUV heading north on a dusty road. Another insisted they saw it turn west into a barren, unmarked trail. The accounts conflicted, and neither could be confirmed. What is certain is that by late afternoon, their phones went silent. No more texts, no more photos, not a single post. Just silence. Their families waited. Minutes turned into hours. The promised check-in never came. By the following morning, worry turned to fear, and the call was made to authorities. Search teams began sweeping the park, covering miles of scorching road and empty trail. And then, they found it. A white SUV parked neatly off a remote dirt track. The vehicle was intact. No sign of struggle. The keys were still inside. Their camping gear lay half-packed in the back, untouched. It looked as if Daniel and Emily had simply stepped out for a short walk, but they never returned. Officers scanned the ground nearby, and that's when they saw them. A trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, cutting through the sand. 2 sets, side by side, stretching into the distance. They followed them, step after step, deeper into the desert. Until, without warning, the prints ended. No turn, no indication of where they went. Just an abrupt stop, lost to the silence of Death Valley. The searchers stood frozen, staring at the empty sand ahead, confronted with the most chilling of questions. Where did they go? The sun was merciless when the first helicopters sliced through the air above Death Valley. From the sky, the desert looked like an alien planet, an ocean of stone and sand, scattered with jagged mountains and white salt flats that shimmered like broken glass. Searchers leaned out of the windows, scanning for any sign of movement, any glimmer of life. But below them stretched only silence. The news of Daniel and Emily's disappearance spread quickly. Within hours, the National Park Service launched a full-scale operation. Rangers drove deep into the park in off-road vehicles. Coast Guard helicopters traced the ridges and ravines. Volunteer rescue teams, locals, hikers, even strangers who had only read about the story, arrived to help. Death Valley is vast, nearly the size of Connecticut, and its terrain is as dangerous as it is beautiful. Searching here was like chasing shadows in a land that wanted to erase every trace of human life. By day, the heat could climb past 120 degrees, blistering skin in minutes. By night, the temperature dropped to near freezing, the desert floor glowing under a cold silver moon. Winds carried whispers across the dunes, sculpting and reshaping them overnight, erasing tracks, blurring trails, hiding evidence. Searchers knew they were racing against nature itself. Emily's parents flew in from Colorado within the first 2 days. The footage of them arriving at the ranger station was heartbreaking, her mother clinging to a photograph, refusing to let it go. Her father trying to remain steady as he spoke to reporters. Daniel's brother arrived soon after, his voice shaking as he told the cameras they loved exploring. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Please, if anyone saw them, speak up. The desperation was raw. And then small traces began to appear. A pair of shoes, half buried in sand, found 3 miles from the SUV. A phone, cracked but still recognizable, discovered near the base of a ridge. A scarf Emily often wore, tangled in a low shrub as though it had been caught in the wind. Each discovery deepened the mystery. How had these belongings scattered across the desert when their footprints had ended so abruptly? Investigators studied the phone first. Its last call had been placed just before noon on the day they vanished, but the signal cut out almost immediately. Oddly, the timestamp seemed incomplete, as if part of the phone's record had been wiped or corrupted. Forensic teams tried to recover fragments, but nothing conclusive emerged. The scarf carried no clear signs of struggle. The shoes showed no damage, no indication of a desperate flight. It was as though the desert had simply picked up these objects and scattered them like BREADCRUMB. Witness accounts, once again, only added confusion. A hiker swore she saw a young couple matching their description walking along a trail at dusk. But another claimed to have spotted them much earlier, near a salt flat miles away from that location. A truck driver reported seeing headlights deep in a restricted area, but when rangers followed the lead, there was nothing there. Conflicting stories piled up like layers of sand, each one leading nowhere. Meanwhile, the media descended on Death Valley. Cameras captured the searchers fanning out in long lines, combing the desert with sticks and flags. Helicopters thundered overhead, kicking up dust storms as they hovered low over canyons. News anchors speculated in grave tones: dehydration, foul play, even the bizarre possibility of paranormal involvement. Online forums lit up with theories. Some believed the couple had staged their disappearance. Others whispered about cults or secret tunnels, or something far more sinister hiding beneath the sands. But within the rescue camp, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing day. Volunteers collapsed under the heat. Medics treated cases of heat stroke and exhaustion. Supplies ran low. And through it all, the desert remained indifferent, swallowing evidence as quickly as it revealed it. One ranger put it best in a shaky interview recorded late one night. "We've searched canyons, caves, ravines. We've scoured every trail we could reach. And yet, it's as if they vanished into thin air. Out here, you expect bodies, you expect signs. But this is something else." As the second week of searching closed in, hope began to waver. The media, once breathless with updates, shifted to other stories. But for the families, the silence was unbearable. They held vigils by lantern light near the edge of the park, their voices breaking as they begged for answers. The desert gave them none. And then came the strangest revelation yet. One of the rescue teams, while reviewing drone footage, noticed something peculiar: shadows in the sand that didn't align with the natural formations. Strange markings half buried by shifting dunes. They were faint, almost erased by time and wind. But some swore they looked like additional footprints, and these didn't match Daniel or Emily. The search had begun with hope. But now it was slipping into fear. By the third week, the desert had fallen silent again. The helicopters were grounded, the volunteers returned home, and the search camps packed up one by one. What remained were questions, dark, unanswered questions that began to spread like wildfire. If Daniel and Emily hadn't simply collapsed from the heat, then what had really happened in Death Valley? Theories began pouring in. On internet forums, strangers dissected every detail of the case, zooming in on blurred photos of the abandoned SUV, speculating on the angle of footprints, the position of the belongings, even the broken phone screen. Locals whispered in diners and gas stations, repeating fragments of rumor until they became something close to legend. Some theories were grounded in reality, others far stranger. One of the earliest whispers pointed toward the fishermen, who occasionally crossed into remote corners of the valley. It seemed absurd. Death Valley is no sea. But smugglers, locals argued, used these vast empty landscapes to move things they didn't want law enforcement to see: drugs, weapons, even people. Could Daniel and Emily have stumbled across something they were never meant to witness? A meeting in the desert, a transaction gone wrong. It would explain the suddenness. It would explain the missing pieces. But others dismissed this idea, saying the footprints told another story. They ended too cleanly, as if both had been lifted away. Some speculated about human trafficking routes, a dark industry that sometimes stretched across borders in ways most people never imagined. The desert, after all, has always been a hiding place for those who don't want to be found. Then came the stranger tales, the ones that crawled out from beneath the old bones of local folklore. Death Valley has always been steeped in stories. Some tribes spoke of spirits that roamed the sands at night, voices that lured travelers away from their paths, whispering promises of water, safety, escape. Tourists over the decades had spoken of hearing cries in the wind or seeing flickering figures on the horizon that disappeared when approached. Some swore Daniel and Emily had been taken by the desert itself, that the land had claimed them. But beyond folklore, investigators turned to something more concrete: suspects. The police quietly brought in several locals for questioning. A gas station worker whose story seemed inconsistent, a hiker who claimed to have seen them but contradicted his own timeline, even a foreign tourist who had been staying at the same motel. Each interrogation revealed contradictions, details that didn't quite fit. Some claimed not to remember exact times, others grew defensive. In one case, phone records from a supposed witness showed a location that didn't match his story at all. And then there were the deleted phone records. Forensic experts revealed that Daniel's phone showed signs of tampering. Certain logs had been erased deliberately. Calls that should have been recorded were missing, replaced by blank gaps. Who had accessed the phone? Was it Daniel himself? Or someone else entirely? And why erase pieces of a timeline that was already so fragile? As rumors swirled, women in nearby towns began coming forward with stories of their own. They spoke of being followed late at night, of strange cars parked outside their homes, of men who watched them at gas stations and motels. Individually, the stories seemed unconnected, but together, they painted a picture of uneasy community, where something darker seemed to be moving beneath the surface. The case was no longer just about two vanished tourists. It had become a mirror for every fear people projected onto the desert. Was it organized crime, using the vastness as a cloak? Was it a single predator, lurking where no one could hear a scream? Or was it something more ancient, something woven into the land itself? One ranger put it in haunting words during a late-night interview, his voice heavy with dread. Death Valley doesn't give back what it takes. You go in thinking it's just a place, but it's not. It's alive. And once it chooses you, that's it. You're gone. And as theories darkened, so did the atmosphere around the case. Families grew frustrated, the community grew fearful, and the story itself took on a life of its own, spinning into conspiracy, legend, and nightmare. But then, just as the world began to move on, Death Valley revealed something new. 3 years after their disappearance, fishermen far from the valley dredged up a coat from desert floodwaters, frozen in mud and tangled with debris. And it looked eerily familiar. Time passed. Seasons shifted across Death Valley, the punishing summers, the rare rains that carved brief rivers through the sand, the cold winter nights where frost kissed the edges of the salt flats. But through it all, the desert held its secret. Daniel and Emily were simply gone. The media, once ravenous for every update, grew quiet. Headlines faded. News vans packed up. Journalists moved on to fresher tragedies. What was once a national obsession became little more than a ghost story whispered. Online, the search budget ran dry. Police officers who once walked the sand with determination rotated out of the case. Their files, thick with interviews and maps and false leads, began to gather dust in the corner of a forgotten archive. But for Daniel and Emily's families, there was no silence. Every day was a torment. Their parents refused to let the memory fade. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they flew back to Death Valley, holding vigils in the desert, lighting candles against the endless dark. They posted photos, begged for new tips, kept the story alive in small corners of the internet. Friends described how Daniel's mother still left his room untouched, as if he would walk in at any moment. Emily's father, once a quiet man, gave interviews that cracked his voice with grief, saying, "I can't bury my daughter because I don't even know if she's dead. I just want to know where she is." In those years of silence, new stories surfaced, stories that suggested Daniel and Emily were not alone. A German tourist, missing since the 1990s, whose car was found half buried in dunes. A hiker in 2009 who vanished during a solo trek, leaving only a backpack behind. Even whispers of 2 college students in the 1970s, never seen again after a camping trip near the valley. Each story added to the sense of a pattern, a chilling undercurrent. People come here, and sometimes they never come back. One investigative journalist dug deep, combing through decades of missing persons reports in the region. What they found was unsettling: scattered disappearances, unsolved deaths, strange reports of footprints that ended in places no human could survive. Locals had always known, the desert swallows people. It doesn't ask, it doesn't explain. For the families, these stories were both a comfort and a curse. Comfort, because it meant their children weren't the only ones. Curse, because it meant there might never be answers. Only an endless desert that consumes and forgets. But then, something changed. In the 3rd year, after another scorching summer, a storm rolled across the valley. Heavy rains, rare and violent, carved channels through the earth, flooding canyons and washing debris far downstream. Fishermen, miles away from the desert's edge, dragged their nets across the flood-fed waters. What they pulled up tangled in the lines was strange. A coat, heavy with mud, Stiff with time. It was a woman's coat. And in the pocket, weather-worn, but intact, was a scrap of fabric with initials faintly embroidered, E.R. Emily's initials. The silence shattered. The coat lay stretched across a sterile metal table, inside the forensics lab. It was stiff, darkened by years of water, and carried the faint odor of decay and salt. Investigators stood around it in silence, as though the object itself was sacred, an artifact retrieved from the jaws of the desert's mystery. For 3 years, Daniel and Emily had been nothing but fading photographs and memories. Now, for the first time, there was something tangible, something real. Under bright white lights, gloved hands began to carefully examine the fabric. Every thread, every stain, every fragment mattered. At first, it seemed almost ordinary, just a coat weathered by time. But then the details emerged. Along the sleeve, faint smears of something reddish-brown. Blood, too degraded to be visible in daylight, but under forensic analysis, it came alive. Tiny flakes embedded in the fibers, telling a silent story of violence or injury. Inside the lining, technicians found something stranger. Fibers that did not match the coat at all. Rougher, synthetic strands consistent with heavy-duty ropes used in industrial work. And then, most haunting of all, an incomplete fingerprint. Pressed faintly into the inner pocket, preserved by time and pressure. Not Emily's, not Daniel's, someone else's. An intruder into their tragedy. The discovery reignited the entire case. Media swarmed back. Headlines screamed across television. Coat found in Death Valley believed to belong to missing tourist. For Daniel and Emily's families, the pain was raw all over again. They had prayed for answers, but what they received was a deeper maze of questions. Police attempted to reconstruct the coat's journey. Oceanographers and hydrologists were brought in to study water flow and storm paths. Could a coat survive 3 years in the wilderness, carried from desert, flood channels into distant waters? Experts debated. Some believed the timing was too perfect, too convenient, that someone had placed it deliberately. Others argued the desert was capable of hiding and revealing objects with its brutal cycles of flood and drought. Meanwhile, new witnesses, silent for years, stepped forward. A retired ranger confessed he had seen a car matching Daniel and Emily's description parked near a restricted trail on the night they vanished. A fisherman admitted that years earlier, he'd heard rumors in the community about outsiders disappearing, but had kept quiet. Each new piece felt like a thread, but when investigators tried to weave them together, the pattern only grew more tangled. Attention soon shifted toward the fishing industry itself, the very men who had found the coat. Among them was a powerful figure, a man whose influence stretched across the desert communities. His name surfaced again and again in whispers, too often to ignore. He owned large tracts of land, had connections in law enforcement, and was known for his temper. Rumors swirled that he had crossed paths with Daniel and Emily, but nothing concrete tied him to the case. Nothing, except that single, unknown fingerprint. Technology had advanced in 3 years. DNA extraction methods were sharper, databases larger. Forensics moved swiftly, swabbing every trace, amplifying every degraded molecule. Each test was like pulling back a veil. Slowly, the secrets of the coat began to unfold. The families held their breath. For 3 years they had been suspended in an agony of not knowing. Now the coat, ragged and heavy with mystery, promised something more. The question was, would the truth it carried bring them closure, or reveal something far darker than they had ever imagined? And then, late one evening, a phone rang inside the police department. The results were in. The fingerprint was a match. The name attached to it was someone no one expected. The fingerprint belonged not to a stranger, not to some drifter or nameless criminal, but to a man whose face the families already knew. It was a shock that rippled through the investigators like lightning. The print matched a mid-level employee in the very search and rescue team that had combed Death Valley in the days after Daniel and Emily vanished. A man who had once stood before cameras, claiming he was doing everything in his power to help bring them home. At first, the possibility seemed impossible. Could the rescuer have been the perpetrator? Or was the coat somehow contaminated during the search? For weeks, detectives retraced every detail. His name appeared again in the logs. He'd been among the first to volunteer, among the loudest to insist that the desert had swallowed them. Witness statements began to unravel. Small things he'd said at the time now carried darker weight. He'd joked once about how the desert keeps secrets. No one had thought twice back then. Now it sounded like a confession. Digital forensics opened the final door. Hidden files recovered from old hard drives, deleted text messages that resurfaced through backups, and then photographs. Not of Daniel and Emily directly, but of their car, their belongings, their campsite. Images taken before law enforcement ever officially found the site. He had been there, long before he was supposed to be. The truth, piece by piece, became unbearable. Investigators concluded that Daniel and Emily had crossed paths with this man, likely while seeking directions or water. What started as a chance encounter spiraled into something darker, a confrontation, perhaps, or a violent outburst under the desert sun. The coat, the bloodstains, the foreign fibers, they told the story of struggle, of lives cut short, and of someone desperately trying to erase his trail. For years he had hidden behind the uniform of a rescuer, the trust of a community, and the vast emptiness of Death Valley itself. When confronted, he broke. Interrogation tapes later revealed a trembling, fractured man. His voice cracked as he admitted the unthinkable. He described how the desert had become both his accomplice and his prison, how he thought the shifting sands would bury everything forever, but the desert had its own will. It gave up the coat. It gave up the truth. For Daniel and Emily's families, the final revelation was not relief but devastation. The horror of knowing their children's last moments, the betrayal of realizing that the man who claimed to search for them was the very man who silenced them. Years of grief collapsed into rage and sorrow. Vigils were held, candles flickering against the wind. People cried not only for the couple, but for the illusion of safety that had been shattered. The case, once a cold shadow, now stood in stark, unforgiving light. The silence of the desert was broken. Yet, as the trial loomed and the community tried to heal, one image lingered above all: the endless expanse of Death Valley, stretching toward the horizon. Its dunes and rocks, its heat and silence, a reminder of both fragility and cruelty. The final shots returned to the footprints in the sand, the ones that had stopped in the middle of nowhere. For years they symbolized mystery. Now they symbolize tragedy. And as the narrator's voice fades, the audience is left with the haunting truth. In the desert, nothing ever truly disappears. And then the last words: if you want more stories of travelers lost, mysteries unresolved, and secrets the earth refuses to keep buried, subscribe. Because some disappearances are never what they seem.